Today we'll learn about a truly peculiar person who did many peculiar things throughout a very mysterious life. He goes down as the only person in history to have snuffed out his naughty bits and snuffed out the life of a presidential assassin. He is the avenger of Abraham Lincoln's assassin, and his adopted name was Boston Corbett. Hello everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Lost and Unfound, where we tell the stories of the formerly famous, the infamous, and the forgotten. We do our best to bring them back to life here. I'm Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us. Born Thomas Corbett, January of 1832 in London, he immigrated to the United States with his family at the age of 8. They eventually settled in Troy, New York during his teen years. He was apprenticed as a milliner, essentially a hat maker, which would have been a typical occupation of that time. But his chosen career has long led to speculation about the tack that his life would take. And this profession famously involved regular contact with mercury nitrate, which was used to convert animal fur into felt on the adornment of hats. And if you've ever read the book or seen the later films of Lewis Carroll's The Adventures of Alice in Wonderland, you'll surely know of the Mad Hatter, which is a direct reference to the widely held belief that these chemicals led to an abnormal prevalence of insanity amongst practitioners of the trade. He married in his early 20s to a woman 13 years his senior, who would die just a few years later, leaving him heartbroken and inconsolable. To assuage his pain, he took to heavy drink, and he meandered between New York City and Richmond, Virginia, before finally calling Boston, Massachusetts, his home in the late 1850s. Repulsed by the racial injustice that he had witnessed in Virginia, he became a fierce opponent of slavery and a lifelong advocate of racial unity and the Union cause in general. In Boston, drunk and despondent and now homeless, he encountered a Methodist street preacher who would radically change the trajectory of his life in all sorts of wild and incalculable ways. He was provided shelter and spiritual guidance by this preacher's flock, and soon underwent a religious epiphany of epic proportions that would ultimately play a huge role in his legend and infamy. He sobered up and he picked himself up off the ground. He found work again as a milliner, and by all accounts was an excellent employee, but his newfound religious fervor was known to rattle some of his co-workers. He proselytized day and night at work and on the streets after his shift ended, and he became a nuisance to some and provided eccentric entertainment to others. He began to kneel and pray at any utterance of profanity or taking the Lord's name in vain. In the summer of 1858, his religious zeal and precarious mental state took a dramatic and gruesome turn. Racked with self-loathing and self-disgust for patronizing prostitutes, which he had done following his wife's death, he chose to do something very dramatic to assuage his sexual urges, which he saw as wicked and ungodly. And I think this makes Van Gogh's ear episode look like child's play. Citing scripture, in particular chapters 18 and 19 from the Gospel of Matthew, parts of which read, "And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. And there be eunuchs, which have made themselves eunuchs, for the kingdom of heaven's sake." So, with a pair of scissors, he does the unthinkable. He quietly castrated himself, after which he prepared a meal and went off to attend a prayer service. Bleeding profusely through his clothes, alarmed fellow parishioners carried him off for medical help. After being released from medical care, a close friend of his remarked, quote,
He was very much gratified by the results, as his passion was not troubled anymore.
Soon after this gruesome profession of his faith, he changed his name officially to Boston, as a sort of an homage, I guess, to the city that he believed had absolved him of his wicked ways. And he also began to don a very different look, by which he grew his hair long in a supposed Christ-like appearance. He continued in his trade and his preaching, and was considered by those that knew him as a harmless, if not sometimes an obnoxious, eccentric, and a religious fanatic. He would frequently harbor the homeless and the destitute in his humble lodgings and offer food and shelter. One of his bosses said of him, quote, "He was a good man, for all of his faults were of the head and not the heart." Well, as the Civil War broke out, Private Eunuch eagerly enlisted in the Union cause. Just as he had been considered a good employee, he was also initially considered a good soldier, but it didn't take long for his religious fanaticism to land him in trouble with his superiors. He was prone to spontaneous biblical outbursts and became a general nuisance to his fellow servicemen. His self-righteousness boiled over when he reprimanded then Colonel Daniel Butterfield for using profanity and taking the Lord's name in vain. This was the wrong guy to target, as Butterfield was a rising star in the Union Army, and he would go on to become a general and eventually the assistant treasurer of the United States. But Corbett refused to apologize and was court-martialed before being sentenced to be shot by firing squad for insubordination. And a quick plug here, we encourage you to check out an episode that we've done called Killing the Cowards, and that's on our companion channel, Well Hung History, where we cover this sort of topic in greater detail. After some time in the brig, his sentence was reduced, and he was discharged from the military service in 1863, only to re-enlist the following year. In 1864, at Culpeper, Virginia, he was taken prisoner by the forces of Confederate General John Mosby and was imprisoned at the notorious Fort Sumter, since known as Andersonville Prison, in Georgia. This was a veritable hellhole of disease and privation and starvation, which ultimately would claim the lives of about 13,000 Union soldiers held captive there during the final desperate stages of the war. At Andersonville, he was applauded for his valor and fearlessness by his fellow inmates in assisting other Union prisoners who were deprived of the basic necessities of survival, and frequently risked death at the hands of his jailers to save their lives. A fellow prisoner there, Richard Thatcher, later said of him, quote, "He had qualities that challenged my admiration, even more than the heroism that he showed on the battlefield. He read passages from the scriptures to me and spoke words of sound and wholesome advice, from which I began to learn that he had the courage of his convictions." And for this, at Andersonville, he rose from a court-martial and a death sentence, and a private to a sergeant. He was released in a prisoner swap during the waning days of the hostilities. Corbett was then transferred to a military hospital in Annapolis, Maryland, where he was treated for a variety of maladies, including scurvy and malnutrition, which would have been typical considering the horrendous conditions under which he was confined. He would go on to testify against the commandant of Andersonville, Captain Henry Wirtz, who would also go down to history as the highest-ranking Confederate soldier to be hanged by the now victorious U.S. government in 1865. Well, let's take a quick pause, and when we return, we'll tell the tale of the mortal deed that gave him his 15 minutes of fame. On April 14th, 1865, in one of the most dastardly acts in American history. The famous actor and Confederate sympathizer, John Wilkes Booth, famously shot and mortally wounded President Abraham Lincoln, and he would succumb to his wounds the following day. Another quick plug here. Though everybody knows that, we take a closer look at the assassination in our companion channel, Well Hung History, in the episode Bad Actor John Wilkes Booth. So we encourage you to find that one as well. Though a previous president, Andrew Jackson, had survived an attempt on his life decades before, eventually beating the would-be assassin Richard Lawrence with his cane, the murder of Lincoln understandably shook the nation to its core. As a result, the local police and the U.S. military immediately sprung into action to hunt the perpetrator. Among those soldiers who was called to duty was Boston Corbett, who remained enlisted in active duty in the 16th New York Cavalry, one of the regiments charged with tracking the killer, who had become quickly identified as John Wilkes Booth. After marching in Lincoln's death procession from the White House to the Capitol, he led prayers over the president's casket and then joined his fellow soldiers in pursuit of the absconder. 10 days later, the assassin and his accomplice, David Harold, were tracked to a Virginia tobacco barn by Corbett's regiment. Harold quickly surrendered, but Booth famously refused to be taken alive. Now, what happens next is mostly known, but the details remain forever mired in a hint of controversy and intrigue. It is known that the barn was set aflame by the captors in an attempt to smoke Booth out. It is also known that Corbett volunteered to his superiors, Lieutenants Edward Doherty and Everton Conger, to storm the burning building and apprehend the assassin himself. But the drama queen was not granted permission to subdue the drama king, and instead he was ordered to return to his position. As the embers crackled, Booth's presence was sighted, and without order, Corbett fired on Booth, hitting him in the back of the head near his left ear. Ironically, almost the exact same wound that had felled the president just 10 days before. Corbett would later say for the record that Booth had raised his weapon towards him, but we'll never know for sure whether that's accurate. Booth, now mortally wounded and completely paralyzed, was dragged out of the burning building and laid on the earth, writhing in agony. He urged repeatedly, quote, "Kill me, kill me." He then famously begged one of his captors to raise his hands to his face and muttered, "Useless, useless," before expiring. Corbett was then dispatched on horseback to neighboring farms to garner provisions for his fellow soldiers. He claimed later to have dismounted and knelt in prayer, reporting that, quote, "When I had gone through my morning prayer, I asked the Lord in regard to the shooting. I was filled with praise, for I felt a clear consciousness that it was an act of duty in the sight of God." Though celebrated as a hero and the great avenger in most of the North, his motivations and actions that deadly day have long been controversial, and it's been suggested that his superiors were furious with him for disobeying orders and acting as a sort of vigilante in defiance of military protocol. Other accounts, though uncorroborated, quote Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, as saying after questioning Corbett, quote, "The rebel is dead. The patriot lives. He has spared the country expense, continued excitement, and trouble. Discharge the patriot." Well, regardless of the deadly details, he did manage to pocket a portion of the bounty that had been placed on Booth's head, and he was hounded by well-wishers in the aftermath of the dramatic event. He was even offered a considerable sum for the gun that he used to dispatch Booth, to which he remarked, quote, "That's not mine. It belongs to the government, and I would not sell it at any price." Following his brief but blinding moment in the limelight. He testified at the trials of the Booth conspirators and then drifted back into obscurity as a Mad Hatter and street preacher in New Jersey and Connecticut. He also would give occasional speeches to churches, civic organizations, and the like, but he was known to ramble incoherently and was rarely, if ever, invited back. He also became increasingly paranoid after receiving numerous correspondence that threatened his life. He was also known to always carry a pistol because of this, and sometimes threatened friends and strangers alike without any obvious provocation. Now penniless and penisless, he drifted to an ascetic life off the grid in Kansas. But just when you think this enigmatic figure is gone for good, he turns up again in an unexpected role that parlayed his former fame. And he was appointed as the, quote, assistant doorman of the Kansas House of Representatives in 1887. But here he goes again, preaching incoherently and eventually brandishing his gun at startled members in the state capitol. He was arrested for this and declared mad and sent to the Topeka Hospital for the Insane. He soon escaped on horseback and told acquaintances he was on his way to Mexico. Whether he ever made his way down there is unknown, as the conclusive trail of this elusive eunuch ends on the dusty plains of the Jayhawk Prairie. Some claimed that he actually went north to Minnesota and perished in a fire there, but considerable academic research since has proven those claims to be false. Since his disappearance, his quixotic life and death took a few more strange twists and turns. Soon after his exit from history, a man in Oklahoma claimed to be Corbett in an attempt to redeem his military pension. He was declared a fraud and sentenced to prison. Another man in Dallas claimed the same in 1905, but was hauled off to the local lunatic asylum in a fitting homage to the man he claimed to be.
This concludes the latest episode of Lost and Unfound. Keep watching on YouTube or find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all the socials. New episodes drop regularly. And if you like what you see, please subscribe. It really does help us create new and fresh content. And be sure to check out our companion site, Well Hung History, where we tell true tales of the condemned and the executed. Copyright Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.